Weston here has put together an amazing group of business leaders across the country. Senator Chambliss was part of the Gang of Six 10 years ago, and probably made the most impact and most progress in advancing bipartisan reform on the issue. So he's one of the wisest folks in the country on this issue, and has traveled the country kind of talking about this. So we're so excited to have him today. Lieutenant Governor Duncan has been at the helm of Georgia Senate, and we've been kind of a shining star in the country for having a balanced budget the last few years, and really striking a nice balance on both the tax and the spending side.
To kick the conversation off, I thought, Senator, you could speak with a unique perspective of having gone to Congress in the mid-90s and been in the House when budgets were balanced. Speaker Gingrich, and it's easy to kind of look at the bygone era, but I've even talked to Leader Daschle, Tom Daschle, about hammering out balanced budgets back when both parties cared, met at the water's edge, and it seemed to mean a lot that the country would preserve its balance sheet with an eye to the future. What, just big picture, what has changed in those 25 years?
Well, probably the most dramatic thing that has changed politically inside the confines of Congress is that the word compromise is a four-letter word. But compromise between Republicans and Democrats has what always has happened, particularly on major issues, and neither side has a patent on all the good ideas. But on any major piece of legislation where there was debate, discussion, and compromise, we got to the best conclusion. When good legislation is done, you have statesmen on both sides of the aisle. You had Tom, you had George Mitchell preceding Tom. On the Democratic side, you had Bob Dole. On the Republican side, Howard Baker. These statesmen are non-existent in either the House or the Senate today. And I say that with those guys in leadership roles on both sides. They're friends of mine. But they're dealing in an atmosphere that is totally different than what we had and your dad and I had in '95 going forward. And it just started changing. And now you've got so many hardcore folks on the far right and the far left that are not conversing, they're not compromising. And I think that's the biggest difference. What they said and what we ultimately concluded within the Gang of Six, that it's not rocket science. If you're going to really attack this albatross that is around the neck of every American, called this national debt. The debt was $14 trillion in 2010, 2011, when we became involved in this discussion. That's manageable. Now, all of you are aware today the debt is $24 trillion, and it's projected based on, if nothing changes between now and 2031, it's going to be $36 trillion, and it's ultimately going to become totally unmanageable. I don't care what kind of policies you implement.
I mean, there's a couple ways to kind of break down this exercise of what the national debt is and what the consequences are. Often as an organization, we try to frame it as a percent of GDP. During COVID, you saw the national debt, publicly held debt, exceed the size of the American economy. That's problematic based on kind of any economic analysis in human history. And I think the real perilous trajectory is that in our lifetime as millennials, over the next 30 years, that number goes from 100% of GDP to at least 200%, but that's based on a pretty rosy picture of where interest rates remain. The structural dilemma, of course, is that as interest rates go up, you just end up having such enormous debt service. I was telling Beau when we gathered here before you all arrived, just the relatively modest increases in interest rates from the Fed over the last few months have caused about $130 or so billion in extra outlays over the next year. That's what those 50 basis points basically cost us. As a kind of fair rounding exercise, if you think about the total national debt being about 30 trillion right now, a 1% increase in the rate at which we're borrowing equates to about $300 billion. This is pretty easy math, to $300 billion annually, just to give you an idea. So often, because of that structural shortfall, we're talking about Medicare, we've identified for 2 decades where cuts can take place. The political left has a real appetite for tax increases, more revenue. I think the part of this conversation that often is missing, and it's the reason that we try to bring state-level officials and even local officials into all of the events we do. We had your colleague, Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina, with us last year, the Lieutenant Governor of Oklahoma, to have a conversation about how the economic engines of America, which is not the federal government, it's states, how do states craft policy for an era, hopefully, of economic expansion, because the other component to revenue is how do you grow the American economy so that while we hopefully make tough decisions about revenue and about spending cuts, we also are in an additive situation where the American economy is growing for a generation to come.
I think one of the most important things at the state level is that we do have a balanced budget because the paperwork says we have to, right? And we all are in the business world, and if you're not willing to put something on paper, it means because you're probably not going to end up supporting it. And so what you see at the federal government, nobody really wants to do what they need to do, and at the state levels we do. Also, the different operating structure with the state level is that we don't have all the tools to spur along or speed up the economy. We have to legitimately invest in it. So like if we want economic development in South Georgia, we've got to start well out in advance and start investing in schools, in infrastructure, in broadband, in healthcare, because if we don't, then there's just no incentive in the world to entice businesses to set up shop there. And so we've got to make real-time investments at the state level. We can't just put our fingers on the scale in such a way that we just, in 1 quarter, we can create some sort of federal program that launches multi-trillion dollars worth of, some sort of program into the marketplace. We've actually got to earn the businesses that we get and keep the people there. It is interesting to see this notion that we send a majority of our dollars to DC for then a majority of those dollars to flow back to the state. So, 70+% of every dollar spent in our budget is driven by a formula. This many people are on Medicaid, times this many dollars, this is what you got to write a check for. This many kids are in K through 12, this is what you got to multiply it by, and this is what the check is. So 70+% of that. But those dollars all flow to DC, get inefficiently spent, and bureaucracy filters it out. And by the time it gets back to the state level, it's a fraction of what we actually sent up there. The bureaucracy chewed up, no business would run that way. No business would set themselves up in a way where you'd send it, to some sort of clearinghouse and they'd only give you a portion of what you got back. I think one of the lowest lying fruits, it's going to take leadership, and certainly there's some weak-kneed folks now that doesn't seem like we're going to get there. But, I hope it's not a crisis that forces us there. But at the end of the day, I think more and more dollars getting to stay at the state level, trusting the state, therefore trusting the people to be better in tune with, just transportation projects. I mean, just give us a document this thick of how we need to build a road, how much rebar needs to be and how thick the concrete needs to be, and we will make sure it absolutely matches up with the roads in South Carolina perfectly. But let us control those dollars. Let us control those projects. Same with education, and I could go on and on and on. We just got to get back to trusting we the people instead of we the government.
Some of this does just come back to leadership. We can talk about the X's and O's, we can talk about the numbers, we can get lost in the weeds. But in just a few short weeks, our organization is going to put together a 20-page document that more or less would stabilize the national debt. It's actually not rocket science. It's just that we've got a real significant lack of leadership. I grew up in the legacy of Senator Coburn's, what I would refer to as tough love. I often was, just as a little kid, on the receiving end of a lot of that tough love. But so were the people of Oklahoma. We often would go home and explain why excessive federal spending, even if it benefited short-term the people of Oklahoma, would not long-term benefit the children and grandchildren of Oklahoma.
Until our nation gets an appetite for real leadership again, we're just going to spin in a circle, right? And when we stop thinking a 280-character tweet is the right way to run a country or a party or take on important issues, then we're going to be stuck in this vicious cycle of just election cycle to election cycle to election cycle. Everything's being politicized at the state level, even at the local level. I mean, just think about whatever neighborhood you live in. If you're up in Forsyth County where I'm at, you know, high density growth, everything is weaponized through politics. What we've seen is this complete disregard for anything other than kind of pandering to the taxpayer, pandering to the voter maybe is a better way to do it. I don't want to be on the watch when something fails. I don't want to be on watch when the economy pulls back. I don't want to be on the watch when something doesn't go right. And in my opinion, that I've seen in the few years I've been around state government, 10 years, has there ever been the perfect idea that shows up in the first draft of a bill? And rarely does it ever show up in the first draft of a bill or even the 10th draft of a bill if it's only signed by one party. We've got to be willing to compromise. If we all went out into a business deal and said, I want you to go out and do this deal and only do it if you get 100% of every line item that we want. It just doesn't work that way. But because we've created this, there's never been a bigger divide between an effective campaign and an effective leader. And that's never been more obvious than right now. So the answer is yes. It's not happening as quick as I want it to, but I worry about a crisis that shows up. I worry about a failing economy that literally just gets everybody's attention in a moment's notice. I worry about some sort of geopolitical event playing out, not just on our TVs, but genuinely affecting us.
One simple change that the Gang of Six recommended was that we means testing Social Security. And when you start talking about taking away Social Security benefits, even high-income earners say, look, I paid into Social Security. I'm entitled to that. That's okay. But if somebody who is in retirement and they got $1 million a year, and now you just pull a figure out, whether it's $500,000 annual income or $1 million of income or more, do they really need that $3,000 monthly check? Or would their lifestyle never be changed if you cut that to $2,500 a month? I mean, when we did that, when we took a 20% reduction in beneficiary payments and means tested it, it's going to means that the Social Security program is going to last for another 30 years.
I think you've got to start to exercise the muscle of fiscal discipline, and I think even if it's 1%, you got to cut the entire federal budget by something. You got to tell every agency, every department that they've got to cut something. We watched this play out at the Capitol. When the pandemic hit, it hit right in the middle of our session. We had not approved the budget yet. The world falls apart. We have to come back for basically a special session, and we had to cut at first 14% across the board. And I remember sitting in my office thinking, these people are going to cry, kick, and ultimately we ended up getting them to all pretty much across the board cut 10% of their budget. And they did it, right? Because there was a spirit of Americanism, a spirit of wanting to be helpful, and they could do it. We got to start to do that at the federal level, right? Everyone's got to start understanding the importance. 1%, 0.5%, I don't know, 0.25%. We got to change the trajectory. The lowest lying fruit for me that I think was most beneficial for the whole ecosystem is healthcare, right? Nobody likes how much they're paying for healthcare. The government can't afford to pay what they're paying for healthcare. The doctors are unhappy, the carriers are, nobody likes their current situation. So for me, that's the most blank canvas for us to go do the most work in early on.